Today, we're going to be talking about some very serious and very personal things. So I want to give some disclaimers up front, nothing major, just I'm going to be talking about some traumatic events in my life, and they may be triggering to some people. So if you are sensitive to certain kinds of stories, this may not be the video for you. The title of this video is not clickbait. I am indeed an alcoholic, and that's what we're here to talk about essentially. So I think we're going to be discussing questions like, well, what does it mean to be an alcoholic? I don't think any two people are alcoholics in the same way or for the same reasons. So I think we got to talk about that. We should also discuss drug addiction a little bit. And it's going to be an interesting time. So I hope you enjoy or don't enjoy or whatever this is about to be, because I really don't know how to talk about this stuff. This isn't like my usual affair. I mean, this is very personal. This is my personal life we're talking about here. It's very private stuff for the most part. But I do feel again that it's very important to talk about, so let's talk about it. I want to clarify something right out the gate because it's something that shocks people sometimes. A lot of people seem to be under the impression that I just dropped out of the cradle yesterday, when in fact I am older than I look, maybe even much older. I turned 34 years old next month, and very few people actually guess that remotely accurately, so that's something that shocks people, and I wanted to avoid shocking you later on with that information. A lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about happened over the last decade or so from about the time I was 24. The story of how I became an alcoholic really begins in earnest a couple years ago when I made a very important life transition. No, not the one you're thinking about, although that one may be next. In this particular case, I had been broke for a very long time, I was unemployed, and all of a sudden, I started making more money than I'd ever seen in my life just by posting to social media because Facebook monetized their pages and I had some very large meme pages. I was making literally 5 figures a month at one point, and it was life changing in the best way possible. Suddenly, I didn't really have to worry about much, and I didn't have to work much. So, of course, making my own schedule, I got to drink constantly. I got to go out and enjoy myself. I got to go to punk shows. I got to see people. I got to do things. I was having the time of my life. And of course, that's how it begins, doesn't it? First, you're just out drinking with friends because it's fun. And then, you wake up a couple years later and you've been drinking for 6 days straight and not really doing anything with anybody. If you've seen this channel before, you'll know that I've been very critical of people's conversion stories of I used to be an atheist and now I'm a Christian, because a lot of the time I don't believe their stories are true. But there is a certain kind of story that I do believe, which is the one where a person says, I used to be an alcoholic and then I found the Lord. Or I used to be a terrible person and then Jesus found me and made me worse. Stuff like that. Those stories, I believe those stories for good reason. I know that religion does help some people overcome issues like addiction, and I guess if you can't afford a therapist, as a lot of Americans can't for obvious reasons, uh, I guess religion is a good substitute, right? It's a community. I know it works for some people, but obviously I do think people should just get therapy a lot of the time, and I think that was the big mistake I made. I should have gotten therapy, but instead I discovered very quickly that alcohol was really good at numbing me and making me not feel my problems so much. I have gone through a whole litany of traumas over the last decade, and I'm not going to tell you about all of them because if I did, this video would be like 2 days long. But I think there are a few that illustrate exactly what happened that caused me to become an alcoholic. I think the first one is a pretty wild one indeed, so strap in, get ready, it's a wild one, fellas. About 10 years ago, somebody kidnapped my best friend right in front of me. Now, he did escape and survive, which is good. Obviously, he was terribly traumatized by the whole thing, too. A little bit later, those same people came back and tried to kill us. We, of course, did not want to be killed, and barely escaping with our lives, we decided to go across the country and stay with my friend's friends. Terrible, terrible experience, 0 out of 10, do not recommend. A little bit after that, I ended up homeless and bouncing around, and I think the next trauma that I can really talk about is I ended up living in my friend's dad's warehouse for many years, off and on, and that was a wild ride because he didn't want me there, and every time he found me there, he would kick me out and freak out, and it was not a good time. It was in the middle of an industrial district, so it was very isolated, it was very lonely. The people who were around there were working there, obviously, not at that warehouse, but other ones in the area, and I had to avoid them. I had to avoid them seeing me because it was pretty obvious and apparent to anyone who did that I lived there. Not the most fun experience, very stressful, just a constant source of anxiety, but I had nowhere else to go. So I was kind of stuck there until the fire department evicted me that one time. While I was homeless and bouncing around, I got dragged into some bizarre situations, and I think that's perfectly encapsulated by the story of how I got dragged into a polyamorous relationship by two of the most beautiful women I had ever known. I was living with them, and it was not a fun experience. And when I say I was dragged into that relationship, essentially what I mean is this: I felt like I had no choice. I mean, they were beautiful, obviously, so that's good. But they were also kind of abusive towards each other and towards me. I mean, they both got very physical in arguments, and the one of them ended up actually physically abusing me in various ways. And it didn't last very long, thankfully. I guess that's the one good thing I can say about that situation. But it's just another source of trauma. And this is the kind of thing you fall into when you're homeless and poor. And I think, like, people just, like, don't realize just how bad it can be and how hard it can be to escape situations like homelessness because of things like that. I mean, you have people you've known for years that you sort of trust. So you stay with them thinking it can help you get your life together, but then it just ends up making it worse. And I guess that's a good way to transition to another story that happened last year. Um, it's sort of like different, I guess, because in this case, I started dating someone thinking I could make their life better. I mean, that's why you want to date people, right? You want to date people because you think they're cool and they deserve good things. And then sometimes you end up just making everything even worse. And in this case, I definitely dropped the ball in a very big way, and we ended up having a miscarriage. And I realized very recently that that is a very hard trigger for me. I mean, around Christmas time, right after I got this channel up and running, I ended up in a huge argument with my whole family because one of my family members made, I guess you'd say, a miscarriage joke. And this family member and I had always been pretty close, but he made that joke and it just set me off. It was like pressing my psycho button. And the whole family took up for him. So that wasn't fun either. And they would say things like, I mean, if you've heard about my family, you know they're all fundamentalist Trump supporting types. And they would say things like, well, why do you even care about the miscarriage? You believe in abortion. And it's like, do you not understand the element of choice? When you have a miscarriage, that choice is made for you. And obviously, it's very tough to go through, I think, for anyone, and especially considering that situation where she actually had to undergo surgery. And she's still suffering for it. And the guilt that I still, to this day, feel over that whole situation is, I guess, overwhelming. Not daily or whatever, but it's something that's there. And I guess in some way, that became the big trauma that spurred the worst of my drinking because I had slowed down before that happened. And then after that happened, it just kicked off again. And it's never really gotten much better. And I suppose the outcome of all of this trauma that has piled up over the years is that I probably developed something of an anxiety disorder. I get depressed, as I think a lot of people do. I mean, it's very odd. It's very conflicting because a lot of the time I've felt perfectly happy, fine, normal. And then, not necessarily like in a bipolar way or whatever, it just ends up swinging back the other way into just this terrible, crippling anxiety and depression over nothing. I mean, it was to the point where I was wondering if I had like a brain tumor or something because I guess there is a certain kind of American arrogance that we all have to some extent, where it's just like we think that we can go through certain things and come out fine on the other side. And I guess that's not the case. I mean, I really thought that I could go through all of these things and just be okay. And the drinking eventually is sort of what revealed to me that no, I couldn't. I'm not okay. And I think it's been more about the anxiety than the traumas themselves. I mean, I probably have PTSD at this point. I think those experiences piled up enough to cause that. But most of the time, it's just like a certain level of anxiety that becomes uncomfortable and like depressing. Maybe that is PTSD. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. But what I do know is it adds up. It adds up, and if you can't get therapy or don't want to spend the money to get therapy, as I didn't, it just becomes like a vicious circle, vicious cycle. And it's very hard to escape that kind of thing, especially now that I'm not making nearly as much money as I used to. So I definitely can't afford therapy, but I desperately need it. So what do you do? Well, if you're me, you drink. In videos, I very frequently point out that a lot of people who have been alcoholics become Christians precisely because they can't get treatment or don't want to or don't even know it's an option. They don't realize that what's behind their alcoholism isn't sin or whatever. It's brain chemistry, and it's brain chemistry that in a lot of cases comes from traumatic events or repressed memories or stuff like that. And for me, I have to say, if you convert to Christianity because you're an alcoholic or a drug addict and it works, you can really believe it, you can really buy it, and it works. I think that's fantastic. Whatever helps you be able to live in a better way is good. But not all of us are capable of that sort of thing. I mean, I couldn't believe in it even if I wanted to. If I wanted to believe that Jesus was really real and was going to heal me from the terrible sin of drinking too much all the time, even if I wanted to believe such a thing, I can't. And I think there are a lot more people out there like me than we want to acknowledge. And I can point to a couple within my own family. There are two members of my family that are what you would call natural atheists, and they're also drug addicts. And they have been convinced through predatory rehab programs and this sort of new missionary field of, you know, I guess these therapy groups or whatever, they've been convinced that they can't get sober unless they believe in God and Jesus and give it all to him. And I think for people like them, that attitude is just not a good one. It's not something that works. I've seen them relapse more times than I can count, and every time they do, well, they assume that God has abandoned them, or they have abandoned God, and it's like a negative feedback loop that does some real harm. And I don't know what to do about that. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, look at me. I can barely deal with my own problems as it is, but I don't know what to do about this sort of thing where these people prey on the vulnerable, the afflicted, and it really does a lot of damage to them. I think about all the people that may have been here if they had been given real help instead of just being told, give it all to the Lord and he will fix your problem. I'm thinking of one person in specific that I knew, another natural atheist, a very open atheist in a place where that was never that popular. He really seemed to believe that because he couldn't believe in God, he could never be repaired, fixed, that this addiction would just stick with him forever. And he ended up taking his own life because he didn't see any other way out. And that's something that's going to haunt me for the rest of my life because this guy, he had a lot of problems. Obviously, it goes without saying, but he was a victim of terrible traumas, and we had been really close at one point in time. He was about a year younger than me, and he died at the age of 27 ish. I guess he was 26 probably, but he he was so young and he had so much potential. There was so much that he could have had in his future if he had found a way to overcome his issues like I'm trying to find for myself. And I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that, this guy who had a smile that could light up a room is not with us anymore. And it's something that could have been avoided by most counts if he had been able to get proper treatment for his problems. And I'm not just talking about the drugs, I'm talking about the things he needed therapy for. Um, I just, it's amazing that I'm here and he's not. Amazing and sad and terrible. And, I guess in a sense, that's what I want to talk about most in a video like this. People like him that aren't with us because they couldn't get the help they needed for various reasons, and it just took them out. And, with these two other family members I was talking about, I've spent so much time worrying about them. And as anybody who's had family members that are addicts knows, it's not just the addict that is hurting, it's their family. And when I think about like my own alcoholism now, I just think, this has to be hurting people to watch. The people in my life, they have to be hurt by it. Um, it's not like I'm a violent or abusive alcoholic or anything like that. Actually, I'm a pretty fun alcoholic, I think. Um, but I'll say things and do things that aren't like typical of me and that embarrass me later. And I know that has to be hard to watch for people that love me and stuff. And that's something I think about, That's something that really weighs very heavily. I mean, the last week or so, it's just been a constant thing of drinking too much and waking up the next morning and really feeling it. Not the hangovers. I don't actually get hangovers. For some reason they stopped happening in my late 20s, even though I wasn't drinking a lot then. Um, but just waking up and going, "Oh my God, what did I say this time? What did I do this time?" Um, and knowing it's never anything like super serious. It's always just something that's like embarrassing. But if it's that hard for me to remember doing and saying things that are that embarrassing, I can't imagine it's easy for the people who love me to watch me do these things, knowing I'm somewhat out of control and not being myself, because I've always been the kind of person that whatever else was going on, I like to be in control. I mean, I practice Stoic philosophy to the best of my ability because it's about control and I like to be in control. I've always avoided the holidays because they are very exciting and excitable times where people just get carried away, and I don't like to get carried away by like anything. So that's really fun, huh? If there is a point, I guess this is where we get to it. The point of this video isn't for me to cry for help, or it's not to say, woe is me, I have it so terrible. It's to say that if you are out there and you are struggling, if you are an alcoholic or an addict, or you suffer from mental health issues, trauma, if you're in a bad life situation, I want to say to you what I wish I could say to certain people that are no longer with us, which is don't stop, keep going. There are so many people that didn't realize how loved and cared about they are and were. The hurt that I've seen and experienced because of certain irrevocable actions people have taken. There's so many things I wish I could say to those people. And in the end, it just comes down to don't stop, keep going. If you're out there suffering from these things, you're not alone. There's so many of us, and it's very often people you wouldn't expect. And you have to keep trying. And there's so many people that care, I assure you. Oh God. I don't want to cry. Like that's not my thing. That's not my vibe, man. I'm not the crying type, but yeah, there's so much I wish I could say to certain people. So I'm saying it to you instead. I'm saying you are loved, you are cared about, and if you're fighting, keep fighting. Don't give up. That's that's the point. That's the point of this video.